it's time for everybody's favorite series where we look at the definitive motorcycles from every manufacturer. This time, instead of the ugliest or worst, we are looking at the very best motorcycles from every manufacturer. And just to clear some things up, we are looking at manufacturers that are still alive today. So we're not going to look at companies like Vincent or Crocker or Brough Superior. We're looking at companies like Honda and BMW and Suzuki and Ducati and Harley. So, I think you understand that. Also, we are looking at the whole of motorcycle history, not just new bikes. In fact, not mainly new bikes. These videos get kind of long, so get your preferred beverage, have a seat, and let's jump right into the very best motorcycle from every manufacturer. Now, for BMW, it would be easy to point to their very first motorcycle back in 1923, the R32, as that motorcycle wasn't just a first sort of poor attempt at building a motorcycle like so many companies have. Right out of the gate, BMW is making some of the best, most advanced motorcycles in the world, and in the case of the R32, this bike would help BMW essentially create their identity in ways that would even last until today. But we talked about that bike quite a bit in our video on the first motorcycle from every manufacturer. So for me, I think the bike to look at is the R75/5 introduced in 1969. Now this bike would not only mark a full recovery for BMW after World War II, which was a big deal in and of itself, but also it would keep BMW alive amidst the absolute onslaught from Japanese manufacturers through the 1970s, while most other companies and countries were forced to pretty much give up on motorcycle manufacturing altogether because they just couldn't keep up. But also, the R75 would set the stage for BMW's bikes going into the future, a focus on reliability and quality. Plus, also this bike, the specifics of the bike are important. It was incredibly beautiful and distinct, but also, fully utilitarian and thoroughly German. But more than anything, it was a competitor to the Japanese offerings, a true competitor, not in performance necessarily, but just overall usability. People wanted a motorcycle that could just go with, little fuss. And that all began in the 70s. So the /5 line for BMW really set them apart alongside the Japanese manufacturers for essentially making bikes that are just easy and great. And for me, this bike is one of those bikes that really is a sweet spot for classic enthusiasts. You cannot go wrong with any of the airheads from this era. In a way, BMW's offerings would almost seem to be a middle ground in some ways between the Japanese superbikes and the British roadsters, in that these bikes, they weren't inline fours, so they did sort of maintain a lot of character, but they were so much more reliable and honestly quality than what the British companies were offering, and that's why they survived. All right, let's move on to Ducati. And for me, though Ducati does have an illustrious history for an Italian manufacturer, and it is impressive the way that Ducati has survived for the past 60 years or so, for me, it's really the modern models that have really proven themselves to be world beaters for Ducati. The Multistrada is great, the Street Fighter is great, but all of the bikes that Ducati has at this point really come from the influence of the modern Panigale line, and for me, it goes straight to the 1199 and 1299. These bikes really redefined multiple times what a superbike and sport bike could be. The 1199 came out in 2012. It produced an impressive 171 horsepower. Now, if you know about leader bikes and their history, and especially from this time, you might think, that's not the most horsepower. You could get more power from a CBR, 1000RR or a GSXR 1000, but the Panigale 1199 weighed significantly less than those bikes. And so it really did have an advantage as a big, powerful bike that also handled amazing, was very lightweight, and also was more advanced in terms of technology. And then the 1299 would again bring Ducati to the forefront of superbike technology. Now, I can only say so much about these bikes. Obviously, these are the twins that sort of predate the current V4s. But the main thing that stands out for me with these bikes and with Ducati's sport bikes going forwards is that the gap between, what a company's race bike and street bike could be is significantly shrunk when it comes to these bikes compared to so many of the Japanese sport bikes. Ducati has forced every major manufacturer to really up their game and to build true race bikes for the street, whether it's, boldly putting completely unnecessary fins on production bikes, or when it comes to those original 1199 and 1299 bikes, just really not caring if the rider is literally roasting himself the entire time. And no matter how ridiculous Ducati's sport bikes might be, you do have to applaud a company willing to make such audacious bikes and being willing to, service them. There's a lot that goes into making motorcycles like this and maintaining them for your customers. And so, yeah, for me, Ducati's sort of modern identity, it all kind of goes back to the 11 and 1299. Okay, this one is quite difficult. Honda has made so many iconic, important, game-changing motorcycles in its history, and there's so many different ways that you could look at this. With many companies, they have a specific focus, like Ducati, for example, but with Honda, they have done and tried everything. For me and for many, the best, most important, greatest motorcycle to come out of Honda Motor Company has to be the CB750. As much as it would be fun to look at one of Honda's more obscure, but kind of outlandish bikes, it's just impossible to overlook the importance of the CB750 in the history of motorcycles. This bike literally changed the course of motorcycling forever, bringing down entire industries and helping shape not only Honda's legacy, but just motorcycling as a whole. Many point to the CB750 as the first superbike because of its incredible power and futuristic engine, but in many ways the CB750 was a sort of grand tourer, more in line with bikes like the Brough Superior SS1000. The CB750 brought in a new era of motorcycles and an expectation of motorcycle companies and what they offer for their big bikes. It wasn't just performance, but it was also reliability and usability, ease of use, just, smooth, great, simple, but also pretty high-tech motorcycles, and of course, the pioneering of the big inline fours as the sporting platform even today. Now, we could go on and on about the CB750. This bike put the Japanese companies on the map in a way that they had never been before. It's hard to really argue against the influence and sheer awesomeness of the CB750 and what it would do for Honda as a company, so I've got to pick the CB750 as the best, greatest Honda of all time. All right, MV Agusta. And man, there's so many iconic motorcycles from MV, both in their first go-around and then also when they were sort of rebooted in the late 90s. And as much as one could argue that MV's race bikes from the 60s should be mentioned, I don't really want to talk about race bikes specifically. I think that MV Agusta's F4, and especially the 1000cc generation of the F4, as much as I love the 750, to me it's the big F4 that came out in 2002 and lasted all the way to 2018 when it was discontinued. That's the really standout bike for me from MV Agusta in their entire history. Now, the original 750 is obviously an iconic sport bike and arguably one of the most beautiful motorcycles of all time, but it's the 1000cc F4 that really took things to another level. The fact that MV Agusta could make such an unbelievably performance-oriented, advanced, and competitive leader bike amidst endless financial troubles and just being so small and basically producing hand-built motorcycles, it's just incredible. For perspective, the Ducati 1199 from 2012 that we talked about made 171 horsepower, but MV Agusta's 1000 made just shy of 200 horsepower at that point. And multiple iterations of the F4 would break records and push the industry to up their game in this category. Now, there's so much more that could be said about the F4, from having the best quick shifter in the world to consistently having the most powerful engine in its class. But for me, it's the relentless pursuit of performance year after year and the amazing reliability that these bikes actually have. This inline four truly is one of the best inline fours of all time, and as it still exists in MV Agusta's lineup with their sort of manic street fighters, it's one of the most characterful, just awesome, ridiculous inline fours that you can get. I mean, it just has this incredible roar, and hopefully they bring back the F4 at some point. But yeah, give this bike a listen. Oh, Suzuki. I'm excited to be talking about the best Suzuki because in spite of making a bunch of bad motorcycles, Suzuki has made some incredible, innovative bikes. Now, it's been a while since we've seen a totally new, impressive bike from Suzuki, so yeah, we are going to have to go back a bit. Now, I know many of you will want me to say the Katana or the Hayabusa, but man, for me, even those bikes owe everything to the original GSXR 750. Few brands have had a motorcycle with this kind of run and this kind of influence, And in the case of the GSXR 750, there's good reason. The Gixxer 750 is the quintessential everyman sport bike. And it was that from the very beginning. The kind of bike that makes you go, wow, that is fast, while simultaneously wondering how you bought it for like $5,000 brand new. The perfect example of investing enough time and money into a platform to make it so great and then just leaving it alone for as long as possible. But it's okay because the original product is still so good. Now, the Gixxer has had some major updates over the years, especially the transition to being liquid cooled, and for its day, it was an incredibly innovative bike. From the very beginning, the Gixxer 750 was known for being lightweight and fast. Essentially, it was a race bike for the street at a time when riders wanted to be able to, cruise to their friend's house one day and then find themselves on the track the next day. This was and is still in some ways the bike for that. Now, we currently have the longest unchanged model of the Gixxer 750, and it's pretty clear Suzuki needs to invest in this platform if they want to have it be a compelling bike going forward. But even with the lack of changes, I still think it's one of the best Suzukis ever made, and in my opinion, it is the best Suzuki ever made. All right, for Moto Guzzi, I'm going to go with the original V7 Sport from the 1970s. Specifically, that was 1971 through 1974. And this is really the pinnacle of this platform, in my opinion. I know this is one of the longest running motorcycles in history, so there's been loads of iterations of the V7. And even with Moto Guzzi's latest update to the V7, I still think this is the best version from the early 70s. Moto Guzzi had already released their popular V7 in the 60s, the bike that won them a contract with the Italian police, as well as the Los Angeles police, and the bike that marked a shift in Guzzi's sort of go-to engine layout from a big horizontal single to this new longitudinally mounted V-twin paired to a shaft drive. And this is where Moto Guzzi's identity as a company would really be formed, but in 71 they upped their game with the V7 Sport, and this was at a time when the motorcycle industry as a whole was really feeling the weight of Japanese influence. The companies that continued to focus on making unique, wonderful, but specific machines like that of Moto Guzzi were sometimes able to survive, and it's awesome because bikes like this are what made it possible for companies like Moto Guzzi to survive. There will always be enthusiasts. This is something that the British industry didn't seem to understand. For them, it was either mass production or nothing. The V7 Sport made 70 horsepower at 6,300 RPM, which is up 20 horsepower from the previous model. That's a massive increase, and 70 horsepower, that's a ton of horsepower for this time. That's more than the CB750 from this time. Oh, and it's actually more power than the current V7, but let's not talk about that. This was a true sport bike and the first of its kind for Moto Guzzi, and arguably the greatest street bike that Moto Guzzi would ever produce. They proved that if you made something unique and innovative in the right ways, that riders would want it, and that's how Moto Guzzi survived. Without this motorcycle, there is no Moto Guzzi today. Boy, it's hard for me to not give it to the RD350 for Yamaha after we just made an entire video about that bike, but I think I've got to give it to the RD500 road/race bike. Now, this is truly Grand Prix tech available for the road, and of course, at this time, that meant some ridiculous two-stroke goodness. Now, this bike did not share every component with their 500cc race bike. Obviously, that would be impossible, but man, it was about as close as it gets for a production motorcycle. I mean, sure, it didn't make 128 horsepower, but 88 horsepower is still a ridiculous amount for a 500cc road bike. In many ways, this motorcycle is also linked to that original RD350. It's kind of a mix between the road-going two-strokes that Yamaha had been developing and also the two-stroke race bikes that they'd been making. Now, this bike has two crankshafts and a counterbalancer shaft, which is very rare on a two-stroke. But the standout feature is that V4 two-stroke. Just an amazing, ridiculous engine, and it's just awesome when a company like Yamaha makes a crazy motorcycle like this available to the public, in the same way that they made the cross-plane Yamaha R1 engine available. This bike really started a trend for the big Japanese manufacturers to offer road-ready versions of their race bikes. For Harley, there's obviously loads of bikes that one could point out. The original Knucklehead, the original Sportster, the Electroglide, the V-Rod. But I think for Harley that we should go a little bit further back. There's one bike from Harley's history and from their early days that really stands out as just an absolute winner, and it really helped Harley place themselves where they needed to be to have future success, and that is the 11F. That's right, Harley didn't always have silly names like the Fat Bob or the Lowrider. These were different times. Prior to the 11F, Harley had introduced their first V-twin a few years earlier, but the platform needed an update. And this was an unbelievably competitive time, even here in America, especially in America. There were loads of new American companies that were pushing the limits, producing compelling motorcycles, and there was no guarantee that Harley or Indian would be able to come out on top in these early years. But it's bikes like the 11F that made Harley Davidson who they would become in those early years. For this model, Harley introduced their first 3-speed gearbox, an automatic oiler, larger intake valves boosting the power to a whopping 11 horsepower. And if you want to talk crap about those power numbers, remember, a Honda Grom makes less power than that. So it's still pretty fast when you think about how long ago this was and what America was like at this time. And brilliantly, with all those features, they managed to lower the price $35 from the previous model. So it made 22% more power and cost about 11% less. Imagine a manufacturer doing that today. Now, the secret was that they switched from an electric headlight to an acetylene one, but hey, the modern rider in 1915 did not care. This bike helped increase Harley's overall sales and helped them survive during World War I on the production side while also making bikes for the military. Now, there are really loads of iconic Kawasaki's that could very easily make this list, and it's all about what you find most important. For whatever reason, no matter how much I look at bikes like the GPZ 900 or even the modern H2, the bike that sticks out to me will always be the Z1, and I think it sticks out for good reason. The first Japanese bike to have a double overhead cam, and this is the first inline 4-stroke from Kawasaki, a company that had largely been known for 2-strokes. I mean, we all talk about Honda's pioneering of the 4-stroke in motorcycle history, and of course that's true. But man, the Z1 really stands out just as much as the CB750, the most powerful production motorcycle in the world upon its release, with a whopping 82 horsepower, which is about 15 more than the CB750. This was voted MCN's Machine of the Year for 3 years straight. This bike was taken to Daytona in 1972 and clocked an average speed of 109 miles per hour for 2,600 miles straight on the track. Pretty crazy. It propelled not only Kawasaki forward in the 70s as a real competitor to Honda, but the entire industry as a whole was really pushed by bikes like the Z1. This would really set up the company to be able to build all of the crazy big 4-strokes that would come. Next up, we have Indian, and for me, this one's pretty obvious. The original iconic Indian Chief, the bike that really made Indian competitive in those later years and still lives on today. This was an innovative bike for Indian. It kept the Power Plus engine from prior to it, but it had a new, modern, sleek styling that would shape American design going forwards. And over its life, the Chief would be updated and grow to 1,200 cc's, and this would really help keep the company alive until their demise in the 50s. It's safe to say that the Chief really made Indian what it was and what it would become even today in their revival. This was and is a massive, sturdy, thoroughly American motorcycle made for the American road. And it's safe to say that even Harley owes quite a bit to the Indian Chief. Next up, we have Aprilia, and this is one company that the more I've researched, the more I've realized, well, there's more to Aprilia than meets the eye. I think most people don't know a whole lot about their history. They really are an interesting company with loads of interesting bikes in their history. And as much as I want to say the RS 250 or even RS 125 should be, considered the greatest Aprilia of all time, I can't deny the current RS V4 is the bike for me. First released all the way back in 2009, like 10 years before Ducati would figure out that they needed to switch to a V4 platform to stay competitive. This bike was giving incredible performance and undercutting Ducati's offerings in price. Aprilia's RS V4, it's its own kind of Italian machine, unique not just in motorcycles, but just in Italian manufacturing as a whole. This bike and this company just makes such unique motorcycles. It also had competitive pricing, competitive specs and performance, maybe a bit dodgy when it comes to reliability, and that certainly is the area where Ducati has beat Aprilia in the last 10 years, and just overall service. But man, there's no denying the RS V4 is one of the most compelling Italian motorcycles of all time. It is the backbone of their current GP platform, and it's just an incredible superbike, arguably just as good as anything that's available in that space. Some experienced testers say that if you're going to get a race bike for you to use on the track and you're good enough to have a bike this powerful, the RSV4 is the bike to get, regardless of price. So, pretty amazing bike from Aprilia, and yeah, I have to give it to the RSV4. Now for KTM, I feel bad using a new motorcycle, but it's just a fact. KTM is in the best place that they've ever been. The past 15 years or so have shaped the company in ways that no other company has in a very long time. KTM is in their prime years, the way that Honda was in the 70s. And for me, no other bike represents what KTM is capable of currently doing more than the Super Duke. And this bike is just ridiculous. It's a V-twin producing 180 horsepower. That's right, a V-twin. And that's where the magic lies. Sure, Ducati have their ridiculous V4. Sure, MV Agusta has their ridiculous inline 4, and, sure, Aprilia has all of their V4 bikes, and, all the Japanese manufacturers have their inline 4s, but this Street Fighter is a different breed, an absolute torque monster V-twin like no other V-twin that has ever been made. 1,300 cc's of juicy goodness, making over 100 foot-pounds of torque, 103-ish to be exact. That's 10% more torque than the Ducati Street Fighter V4, and all of that is made at 1,500 less RPM than the Ducati Street Fighter. And this bike is cheaper. And this is because it's not a detuned sport bike, like all of the other Street Fighters. It's its own crazy engine, whereas the Street Fighter is, somewhat of an afterthought for many manufacturers, sort of a weird byproduct of their superbike, whereas the Super Duke feels like its own thing, kind of more in line with the Speed Triple RS or something like that. So yeah, it's got to go to the Super Duke for me. Okay, I have a feeling you guys are going to guess my pick for Triumph. I've got to give it to the Bonneville, and I'm talking the original Bonneville, not the new copies of the Bonneville. Now, many of you could point out that the Bonneville was a leaky, unreliable piece of junk compared to anything that Triumph has today, but that's really not the right way to look at these kinds of motorcycles. The Bonneville was so influential, so iconic, and truly great for a reason. It was the absolute fastest motorcycle that you could buy in its day, and for a very long time, it showed the world what a motorcycle should be. And some would argue is still today showing people what a motorcycle should be. Both beautiful, but also performance-oriented, fun, accessible, easy to work on, reliable if you understood the machine, and, were willing to keep up with the maintenance. Oh, and beautiful, if I didn't already say that. Every motorcycle going forward, whether we're talking about the developments in style for the Japanese bikes in the 70s, or, even just what a child thinks of when they think of a motorcycle, they may not even realize it. They're basically picturing a Triumph Bonneville. And all of that goes back to that bike from the 60s. I've talked about Triumph's history multiple times. I've talked about this motorcycle multiple times. So there's no need to go into all the details about the specs and features. It's pretty simple for me. Motorcycles should be cool. And no motorcycle is or was or will ever be cooler than the Triumph Bonneville. At a time when motorcycling was at its absolute peak, the heyday of motorcycling in the 1960s, the Triumph Bonneville was the bike. So that's my pick. All right, let's finish things up by looking at Royal Enfield. Despite having a long, very long history with lots of great bikes, Royal Enfield is also a company that went entire decades without really innovating or updating or really doing anything interesting. But much like Aprilia, Royal Enfield's day is today for me. This is the heyday of the company, and the motorcycle that stands out is the Interceptor 650. And it's not because it's necessarily a standout motorcycle in and of itself, really in any ways, But much like many great motorcycles and also cars from history, it's the sum of the parts that makes the bike so awesome. The Interceptor just shows for me Royal Enfield's unique understanding of what riders want. First, they want a bike that's affordable. It's got to have a low price. The thought that you or I can have such a cool and fun motorcycle right out of the gate, right after we get our license, for under $6,000, that is super reliable and can have great support, that's what the Interceptor is. And much like the Bonneville in its day, the Interceptor is just cool. And for me, that's all you need. So I've got to give it to the Interceptor. All right, guys. Well, I know videos like this can anger riders, and that's totally fine. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below if you are angry. Maybe you can convince me as to why my picks are way off, and maybe I'll pin your comment if you're successful. Obviously, this video and others like it are just for fun, so just join in the fun. And yeah, let us know what you think. Thanks for watching. We'll see you guys in the next video. Ride safe.